Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody. I can see the room is filling. Um, if you've made it into the room, congratulations. Hopefully, everybody saw the email that I sent out that suggests that we may run out of space, but hopefully, I can see. Yeah, the numbers are going up. All right. So, a few months back, here in the UK, students who had been diligently preparing for life after high school learned that their final grades, their A levels, would be handled by an algorithm. Despite warnings from many commentators, the off-qual grading algorithm went to work, handing out grades based on the previous performance of students at respective schools and a range of other factors. The result, you may have heard, was somewhat problematic and created a veritable shitstorm. Students protesting in the street, masks donned, parents sharing horror stories on Twitter and social media of their hardworking spawn being ruthlessly downgraded on the basis of factors that didn't seem to add up. After a short while, the whole thing was scrapped, and social confidence in the work of algorithms was, to say the least, not high. While particularly eventful, stories like this are no longer exceptional. Today, talk of algorithms is not relegated to scientific institutions. We learn about how the algorithmic techniques that comprise news feeds are used for sinister forms of micro-targeting. We see demands for explainability emerging in some countries as everyday things, such as nursery placements, are handled by algorithms, which is the topic of one of my own PhD students, Lou, hello, who's recently submitted. Congratulations. We see time and time again facial recognition software modeled on whiteness. Algorithms we now know can be oppressive. They've been described as weapons of math destruction. They are a matter of concern for some, or of outright critique for others. This is what we're talking about today, continuing on from our last session, which I'll link to for people if you didn't manage to get there. Welcome to the Centre for Digital Inquiry, based at the University of Warwick. I'm the director of the centre, where I also act as a reader in digital media and culture in the Centre for Interdisciplinary Methodologies. Today, we are talking algorithms. Specifically, we're discussing Bernhard Rieder's remarkable book, Engines of Order, a Mechanology of Algorithmic Techniques. Before we get into things, I have to say this is somewhat of a remarkable book that promises to be field defining. And indeed, although usually I'm a bit wary of making claims to a work being a kind of canonical piece, certainly a book that I think stands a good chance of becoming a classic, an immediate classic. So allow me to introduce Bernhard. After studying communication, history, and philosophy at Vienna University, he obtained a PhD in information and communication sciences from Paris 8 University in 2006, where he was subsequently appointed assistant professor at the department Hypermedia, co-directing the Creation and Edition Numériques master's program. He worked as a software developer with the Austria Press Agency and other companies for several years, and he has since contributed to numerous software projects, mainly in the areas of digital research, methodology, data viz, and geolocation. He writes and maintains a number of forms of software, including the Tkacz tool, the Tumblr tool, the YouTube data tools, LineMiner, RankFlow, and others. Today, Bernhard is joined by Taina Bucher. Taina is an associate professor in screen cultures at the Department of Media and Communication at the University of Oslo. She's the author of If Then, Algorithmic Power and Politics, published with Oxford University Press, and is currently in the final stages of a new book about Facebook for Polity Press. Taina got her PhD in media studies from the University of Oslo in the Department of Media and Communication. She's been a visiting scholar at the New School, New York University, the Infoscape Research Lab at Ryerson University, and at the Department of Media, Culture and Communication at New York University. Taina has published a number of highly influential articles in addition to her monograph on the topic of algorithms. Most recently, things like the right time web, theorizing the chirologic of algorithmic media in New Media and Society, co-authored pieces like To Be or Not to Be Algorithm Aware in Information Communication and Society, The Algorithmic Imaginary, Exploring the Ordinary Affects of Facebook Algorithms, Machines Don't Have Instincts, Articulating the Computational in Journalism, and earlier pieces such as the widely cited Want to Be on the Top, Algorithmic Power and the Threat of Invisibility on Facebook. Okay, so now that we are familiar with our speakers, if you aren't already, the format of today's discussion will be as follows. We'll begin with Taina taking a few minutes to introduce Bernhard's book. She will then lead with some questions for Bernhard. And after responding, Bernhard will in turn have an opportunity to ask Taina some questions, beginning a dialogue that remains close to the book Engines of Order, but opens out to consider Taina's own intellectual trajectory. When the discussion becomes unruly and, dare I say, unfocused, I will intervene with my own question for our two guests. For the last part of the hour, we'll turn to questions from our webinar participants. You, the participants, will have the opportunities to post questions and also upvote others' questions throughout the talk. Please be considerate when posting questions and note that those posting questions may no longer be fully anonymous and the event is being recorded. Okay, so a big welcome to Taina and Bernhard. And now, Taina, over to you.
Yes, hi everyone. It's really nice to see you all, and for this opportunity to engage with Bernhard's book. I've prepared a few comments and questions, but before I do so, I will just spend a few minutes to introduce the book Engines of Order for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it. It's a huge accomplishment, I think. As Nate has already said, I think this will be a modern day classic. It offers a really rich and well-researched account of the algorithmic techniques underlying information ordering. So before I begin, congratulations, Bernhard, for this wonderful book. Here it is. What the book does basically is to weave a deep historical account of the techniques and mathematical principles of information ordering devices and recommender systems with the philosophical understanding and underpinnings of technicity and mechanology offered by Gilbert Simondon. The first half of the book lays out the philosophical and conceptual groundwork, while the second part of the book delves into 4 distinct case studies, each looking at the history and technical function and social embeddedness of a specific class of algorithmic techniques. And these algorithmic techniques are then, or the specificity of these techniques are embedded in information ordering. So he looks at so-called coordinate indexing that forms the basis of relational databases, the vector space model, a technique for information retrieval that forms the basis of ranking and relevance in recommender systems. He then goes on to the base classifier instructive for understanding machine learning, or how machine learning operates more broadly. And then he finishes off with network algorithms and graph theory in the specific case of Google's PageRank. And the very last part then discusses and synthesizes these ordering techniques into a discussion of technical culture more generally. And it's not very unlike Simondon's own work on the existence of technical objects in the way this book is being structured. So I think that's quite nicely done. And the purpose, Rieder states, is to, quote, to address a small subset of the technical substance that lurks behind terms like algorithms, unquote. So rather than centering the algorithm, actually, he says he tries to avoid the term altogether. And I think we will discuss this decision in a bit. So he suggests instead to look at these more general, but still variable algorithmic techniques. An essential thesis in the book is that in order to adequately understand how things like Google search or Facebook's newsfeed works, scholars need to develop an understanding of their underlying techniques. So what are the technical principles at work? Where do these ideas animating their operations come from? And what concepts do these ideas draw on, and so forth? So these are important questions that he is addressing in that book. Drawing on the notion of cultured techniques, Rieder extends this thinking onto the domain of algorithms, arguing for a similar conception, drawing on central figures such as Bernhard Rieder, who argues that concepts such as time and space, for instance, do not exist independently of the cultural techniques of time measurement or techniques of spatial control. Rieder suggests in similar ways that algorithms draw on algorithmic techniques, and that order, which is a core concept in the book, does not exist independently of ordering techniques, ordering devices. If the historical analysis of these broader principles and strategies for solving specific computational problems constitutes one important aim of the book, another important point of departure lies in technical practice. So being a software developer himself, Rieder gets at the analysis of algorithmic techniques from the perspective of software making. Software, Rieder says, quote, draws on rich reservoirs of existing knowledge, unquote. Indeed, these algorithmic techniques that, for instance, are used to sort lists or tell a programmer how to classify a text message or make a good recommendation, really draws on this existing body of knowledge, or the archive, as Foucault would have it. So software making entails knowing when to use what technique and how the techniques can be combined into a working system. What Rieder argues is that algorithmic techniques are essentially technical ideas with their own histories, yet simply describing them might not be enough for a proper understanding of these systems. So if much debate concerning the power of software and algorithms in society has centered on calls for more code literacy, I think Rieder's book is also a useful reminder that perhaps what matters more is a cultivation of sort of a technical literacy, more broadly understood. So for Rieder, technical knowledge entails learning the realms of what's possible. So to know algorithmic techniques is to acquire a vocabulary of possible functions that then serve as a horizon for technical imagination. So the idea is that a limited number of elements can yield an almost unlimited number of combinations, or what he would reference to Deleuze calls the fini unlimited, or the fini unlimited episteme. This also relates, of course, to Simondon's philosophy of technology, that sees machines as evolving entities characterized by internal conflicts in their structures and functions. So I think from this So a quite short description. I want to move on to sort of let's call it theme one, a cluster of questions that relate to sort of the core theme of the book in terms of algorithmic techniques and information ordering. So the first question, I guess, would really be to ask Bernhard to elaborate a little bit more on what exactly he means by, or what exactly you mean by algorithmic techniques, and why you prefer this term over the more colloquial use of algorithms. And following from this, I guess, what does the focus on algorithmic techniques allow? What does it allow for? So in epistemological and methodological terms, that perhaps a focus on algorithms as a term would not, or at least not in the same way.
Yeah, I think it's my time to answer this. Well, first of all, really thanks a lot for having me, and Nate and Taina for taking the time. I mean, I think in a certain sense, you in your presentation, you already like highlighted some of the aspects that I think kind of led me to this term algorithmic technique, and I would say there are like a number of reasons why I indeed kind of try to not so much avoid the term algorithm, but maybe don't burden it with too much explicatory power, and maybe rather ask so actually what goes into algorithms, right? And when looking at that, I'm you know, when writing the book, I was often thinking about my own practice as developer. Not that this is kind of the via regia into talking about software, but I think it's a certain space of inspiration, right? And when looking into like how people build software, I mean, there is definitely something like algorithm making in that. But a lot of it, I think, is much less structured than that, and is much less is kind of like setting process of like a reified artifact, and it's much more kind of looking into the problem space. What are we programming? Why are we programming? What are the solutions that we want to have? And in our like own knowledge, right? So what do we know already? What have we dealt with similar problems before? What have we done then? And indeed, that very often then leads to like some consulting of the record of computer science, but I think rarely in the form that you would take like this one algorithm and say, now here we apply it, right? There's more a discovery process that I think that draws on knowledge, but in a more flexible way than the term algorithm maybe suggests. And I mean, in the book, I am definitely like naming a number of algorithms, such as PageRank, for example, which is really like a very well-defined algorithm, right? It can be summarized in a single formula, right? It has a canonical formulation. But then looking at just taking one step out of a singular algorithm, you notice, there's a lot of other stuff that uses very similar principles that maybe have, maybe instead of computing a single metric, it's going to compute two metrics. Or instead of ranking, it's going to perform some classification. And that is really that space that I was getting more and more interested in, moving up a little bit. You know, it's still kind of, those are still specified, well documented spaces, but there is flexibility. There are kind of, and not just in terms of parameters, but, you know, in terms of tweaks, in terms of general ideas. I mean, just to give you an example, I think in the book I discuss quicksort quite a bit, right? And quicksort is one very well-known sorting algorithm, but that's part of the larger family of algorithms that sort by exchange, right? So it's a particular approach, and in that family there are you know, there's more than one, right, algorithm. There are a number of similar ones. But at that level of, let's say, exchange sorting, there's something, yeah, there's something like a family emerging. And I think that is really what the term algorithmic technique tries to thematize, that when developers build software, they draw on a, you know, sometimes more reified, when we, for example, use modules or really like canonical formulations, and sometimes more, you know, screwing around type of, you know, drawing on previous knowledge. And from a, I think, methodological and epistemological perspective, that approach allows a little bit to avoid this kind of definitional knowledge that we sometimes, I think, overuse a bit in the humanities, right? For example, when I have a definition of what an algorithm is, right, the famous, you know, finite sequence, then I don't know much, you know, I still know nothing about algorithms, actually. So there's, I think, a false sense of security there. If we define the object, then we can understand it. And I think that leads to this kind of like foundational thinking that focuses on like the lowest level of computation, and then very often doesn't pay a lot of attention to the, you know, now what, 70, 75, 80 years that people have been, you know, accumulating all kinds of techniques, all kinds of approaches, all kinds of ways of looking at the problem. And that's really what I'm interested in, to kind of historicize these idea spaces and thereby maybe find a way of narrating them that is also more accessible to a humanities kind of style of reasoning, right? Not as involved and not as mathematically detailed as, you know, that level of, let's say, concrete algorithms, but also less general than simply kind of trying to press the notion of algorithm is kind of like one concept or one kind of reified way of thinking.
Great. Well, I think that your approach and your book is already extremely detailed. So if you're thinking about that as sort of a model for how humanities or how our students are approaching these issues, they have a lot of work in front of them, because the level of detail historically that you demonstrate in the book is quite something. I'm actually curious, so when we're now speaking about levels of analysis, where do you locate the historicity of algorithms? I just want to talk briefly about this idea of mechanology, because what I found, now I'm not an expert on Simondon at all, but what I find fascinating about Simondon's mechanology, as far as I can understand, and the way in which he lays it out in on the existence of the technical object, that he sort of uses a photographic rendering in a way to depict the genesis and evolution of technical objects, right? So he has these images of where he studies the motorcycle, motors and electronic tubes and the telephone, by way of sort of showing or producing sort of a serialized set of images that are meant to depict the evolution of those technical objects. So just dissecting them into their constituents, and basically, you know, just the example of the motorcycle or the combustion engine, you know, in I don't remember, like 7 black and white images, or 7 or 9 black and white images, then showing how the combustion engine changes over time. And I was just wondering if sort of the goal, as far as I understand mechanology, then is partly to depict the time of machine beings, sort of. And then he uses this photographic method, which is then ultimately about arresting time, to what extent then does it matter what the starting point or the starting time of this depiction of change, and also then the cutoff time for understanding the ongoing development and evolution of these technological or of these technical objects, right? How would you think about this in the context of algorithmic techniques, sort of the Bayes classifier, for instance? Does it change in the same way as the combustion engine?
Maybe. No, but probably not in exactly the same way. But I mean, I think you're really putting the finger on what I find so attractive in Simondon's thinking, right? Is that he thinks technology from technical objects, right? So he doesn't talk about techne and then, you know, there's the hammer or something, right? No, he talks about the technology of his day, right? And I mean, the combustion engine plays an important role. The diode, triode plays an important role. A vacuum tubes, and he dissects them in really, as you said, quite some detail. I mean, he has this idea that a technical scheme or schema, right, that basically defines a technical object has a real starting point somewhere, right? And for him, the notion of invention really exists, you know, and it doesn't have to be necessarily this kind of like singular act of genius, but there are kind of these decisive moments, right, when something new emerges, and that is indeed when a lineage starts, and in many ways observing lineages of technical elements, individuals, is maybe what mechanology is about, right? It's really kind of looking at a singular principle, for example, the combustion engine, as it you know, kind of moves you know, throughout the ages and evolves and you know, becomes more performant, but also maybe smaller, maybe lighter, maybe less resource intensive, and maybe the way its power kind of grows, it allows for new usages, but for him it's still the same technical lineage. And I think one can do this really quite well with software, if one has this kind of like smaller view on indeed something like the Bayes classifier or something like deep learning, right? I really think that you can look maybe in a more distributed way as, you know, really like a starting point, at a starting point of that lineage, and then look, for example, how you know, how maybe you know, certain aspects have changed, how you know, implementations have become more performative, and that can really be crucial. I mean, the deep learning revolution of the last 10 years has certainly in part to be attributed to the fact that these algorithms run on graphics cards, right, on massively parallel computing engines, and therefore it's suddenly possible to use them in real world applications with, you know, a lot of data and below a certain threshold of waiting time, and so forth. And this, I think, is probably where maybe we really need to look beyond Simondon, right? Because I do think that while we can maybe at this more specific level identify a series of techniques, trace them, and you know, discuss how they work, I think concrete software objects, whether they're, you know, like a piece of software that runs on your PC, or, you know, like a full scale you know, a platform, they're becoming really more and more modular, and they really connect many different trajectories, and that is, I think, when it really becomes difficult to you know, have this, what you call the photographic you know, method, where you really identify maybe clear stages or something like this, and it becomes really quite difficult to do that, also because the object continues to change, not just in terms of there's a new model or something being introduced and sold, but no, the platform is being updated every day, the software patch is applied, right? So even the singular app, you know, keeps, I mean, the motorcycle, once you once you sell it or once you buy it, you can still tweak it or something, but it doesn't get upgraded by the creator of the software. And I think here we really see some of the limitations of that kind of somewhat linear model that Simonon introduces.
Although, just to interject, as I have the right to do as a moderator, would you not suggest that the idea of a kind of versioning history then may actually precisely do that work? You know, when you can follow updates and you can compare and contrast software at the level of code or something like that. So something like the version becomes the thing that you kind of compare over time.
Not true. I mean, I think that's an interesting thought, and I think in many cases you can indeed do that. I mean, but increasingly, of course, the latest version replaces everything else, right? So it's actually hard to keep an app in the state of its initial and a full platform like Facebook. We have no clue when what is being updated. Yeah, but I think that also shows the variety of software, right? It's I mean, Taina in her book, for example, talks about the multiplicity of algorithms, both in terms of how people look at them, but then also simply the objects and the multiplication of objects out there, and it may simply be impossible to say we're having this like one way of dealing with software, because it's everywhere and it comes in so many shapes and forms.
Yeah, so I also want to give you the chance, I guess, to talk a little bit more about sort of the main topic of the book, which is information ordering, or the body of your book with all your exciting case studies. So following, I guess, from the first question, I'm curious as to the specific, like maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this specific domain of information ordering and how you came to be interested in that domain. I think you wrote a PhD a long time ago that perhaps introduced you or to these topics. You perhaps can tell us what your PhD was about, but that this sort of long-standing interest of yours in information ordering as sort of the domain where you study these algorithmic techniques, and perhaps tell us how that domain or how your thinking around algorithmic techniques is influenced by this specific domain of information ordering, but also how information ordering or how you see the importance of studying something like information ordering and information and library systems into the space of contemporary media. Why is that such an important historical lineage to trace for instance, for a media scholar to be interested in that? And are there other ways besides information ordering that we could conceive of engines ordering in the world? So what other domains, if you were to write another book about engines of order, do you have an idea of the domain that could form part of a next book?
Yeah, I mean that domain information ordering, I think in many ways for media scholars is a bit, I wouldn't say like the obvious space, but it's I think when we today discuss algorithms, of course, we're looking at a much wider variety of things. But when we talk about particularly online systems, we're often discussing about the way that this or that piece of information is being recommended. We're talking about which kind of point of view gets more exposure, more visibility. I mean, I think your work is is very much on a similar topic space. And I think if we start with search engines from a media perspective, it's so obvious that something politically relevant is happening here, right? That you type a search query into an online form field and you get this kind of like ranked list of stuff that pertains to your query. And I do think that there has been this, before the field of algorithm studies, there has been a field, you can call web search studies or search engine studies, that I think looked into some of the very similar problems that we're discussing now, right? The power of Google is now, I think, something that has been around for quite a while, and I was really fascinated by that, right? As an object of conceptual thinking, but then also as an object of inquiry. And I did my PhD at an information science department, and I kind of had the opportunity to look a bit through some classes I took, talking with people, to look a bit into this like almost ongoing, I wouldn't call it war, although I do call it war in the book, between kind of the more library tradition that has a certain way of thinking about information ordering in terms of ordering of knowledge, right? And then these more algorithmic approaches that feed into search engines, feed into recommender systems, and so forth. And I think it's just an interesting example of a history that really doesn't have this kind of continuity that historical research sometimes tries to evoke, right? This idea that the card catalog is then becomes the database, something like this. And I think here we have actually a much more confrontational, much more how to put this, much more contradictory and even philosophically divergent setting, and that I thought was very interesting as an approach, right? To really narrate that break from library techniques towards something like coordinate indexing. And I think in many ways that story also really feeds into a lot of what we're discussing nowadays, right? Information retrieval, which is this kind of big competitor of library techniques in the 1960s, 1950s, 1970s, really is one of the places where AI techniques are being pioneered, right? So we have this kind of different lineages, and this is maybe one that hasn't been narrated so much. And I thought, that was would be interesting to look at. I also thought it was interesting because it isn't as heavily mathematized as some of the AI stuff, so it's maybe a bit more accessible. But it was also just a bit of a marriage of convenience, right? That I suddenly had access to like people working in the field and so forth. Now the question whether there could be other fields. I mean, definitely so. I don't think that my point with this concept of engines of order was so much to say that there's a class of things out there that are engines of order, but rather looking at indeed, cultural techniques, cultural practices that involve ordering, right? That involve arranging something, putting something in front of something else. And that is, I think, something that we find in many places. I mean, Donald Mackenzie, he wrote this book, An Engine, Not a Camera. And that was actually one of the inspirations for my own work. And he talks about economic models as being engines that transform the spaces that they operate in, right? So I think one could look at a whole variety of things, and potentially even at something like interface grammars as fulfilling that kind of purpose. Although I mean, I do think that it really comes the concept comes in its fullest when it has this kind of like automated character and this kind of circular cybernetic feedback logic.
Great. I mean, I can just like move on with, I have tons of questions. Should I maybe take one more and then give you the chance to answer some of the incoming questions from the audience?
Or maybe I could also ask a question.
No. Yes. Taina, do you want to go with one more, and then Bernhard, you can reply with a question. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things about your book is that that it is, of course, written from a particular point of view. And we already touched upon this, but right, the point of view as a software developer, you knowing this stuff, not just intellectually, but also very practically. So, which is, of course, just gives to the richness of the book and your analysis. So if we take this very particular point of software making as sort of a point of departure for this question, one of the things that you say in your book is that we cannot study technical systems if we lack the capacity to imagine how a system could be constructed. And I guess, to me, that can mean many different things, right? When we think about imagination and speculative futures and all that. But you seem to be situating this imagination in software making primarily. So my question, I guess, is what a mechanology of algorithms would look like, and if that's possible at all in your mind, from the perspective of an end user rather than a software developer, or does a mechanology of algorithms necessitate this software making point of departure?
Yeah, no, I think that's in many ways also really connects to a wider question, right? Like how to deal with algorithmic systems as they perform increasingly important tasks in society, and I think, I mean, more concretely, one could even ask, what do policymakers have to know, right? So there are all of these kind of different subject positions, and I really think it depends again on the artifact. I mean, I think something like the grading algorithm that Nate mentioned in the beginning of this session, I think is probably not a very complicated object. So I don't know, right? So I would have to look into it. And one could maybe, explain that in a number of lines, or with like an infographic or something like this, right? And that would then really be enough. And what I'm of course thinking about are more things that indeed happen, on large scale platforms, that happen, within our smartphones. And I think one of the examples I use in the book is to think about, something like image recognition, which something like Google Lens, how does it work? And it becomes really difficult, I think, to think about how this could work without at least some kind of technical culture that doesn't have to be like software making, but indeed has some connection to at least the largest lineages of algorithmic techniques and what they more or less represent, right? And I think that really helps. That doesn't mean that it's the only way of doing it, right? I do think, for example, that we see, and I mean, I think a lot of your work is dealing with algorithmic imaginaries, right? And I think we do see users create like workable models of maybe not, kind of the algorithm per se, but maybe some of, kind of its general commitments, its general tendencies. I'm currently teaching a course where we have a number of students looking at TikTok, right? And they indeed develop, you know, kind of some understanding of what is happening here. But I do think, you know, being familiar with some of the larger principles really happens or really helps to do this. Yeah.
Do you want to take the opportunity, Bernhard, to offer a counter question?
Yeah, I mean, because I think in many ways, I mean, the questions we've asked so far are quite connected, right? Algorithms versus algorithmic techniques, multiplicity, and I had this question that kind of like rereading like your book before this talk, which I really love. It's such a great book. So that was a real pleasure. But I also had this question because I think you stick to the term algorithm, right? But it seems that you're also kind of constantly then like evoking its multiplicity, right? The way that kind of different people you know, look at maybe the same algorithm or the same piece of software differently in different situations. And what I thought was maybe kind of, yeah, in both of our works, you know, ends as a little bit of a question mark is how to bring kind of the different methodological approaches that we have together, right? I see there's, you know, there are ethnographic approaches, there are more conceptual approaches, there's reverse engineering, but my impression is that we're so, I don't think like under-equipped, but there's such a big mountain in front of us, right? Like computing has become like so huge, so there's just so much, right, happening. And I'm wondering like what kind of setting do we need to maybe you know connect these different methodologies a bit further?
Well, I don't think that I really have an answer to the connection question. I guess how they might be connected. I guess the approaches depend on the questions that we ask, right? And we ask different sorts of questions, and different approaches are good for different kinds of questions. And I think that we might actually ask a little bit of different questions. It seems to me that you are very much interested in this question of what the algorithm is by way of asking what's in the algorithm and thinking about the function and highlighting the operation of the algorithm, right? So this notion of operative media that a lot of people coming from the Simondonian lineage kind of are thinking with, right? So what does it do? And whereas I'm certainly also interested in those questions. And for those questions, I agree that, you know, you cannot answer what's in the algorithm or how it operates without necessarily acquiring some sense of this vocabulary that you're talking about, right? I'm still uncertain about at what level this vocabulary needs to be developed, right? And certain people or different people disagree as to what that vocabulary should look like, how abstract and how concrete. I think what I'm personally more interested in is, you know, the work that this algorithm as a signifier, as a thing that we tend to talk about, like what it does in the world to different domains. Because a domain like journalism that I've been studying on and off, they are certainly not talking about, or a typical newsroom will not talk about algorithmic techniques. They invoke this idea of an algorithm, and it's certainly the case that the idea of an algorithm is what's guiding a lot of new strategies and development in that space, right? So thinking what goes into the understanding of that term then is a different different question and problem than being very interested in its sort of essence, if we might, like in its technical or in the specific technical elements, though those technical elements are certainly part of what a more high level understanding of algorithm as an object of study might entail. So I think there are just like many different questions out there. And that's what I think is exciting, that we're seeing so many different scholars from different disciplines talking about algorithms, but what we're talking about when we're talking about algorithms is so dependent on the domain specific questions and interests. And I think there's space for all of it. So I'm very happy for the different approaches. And they should not always be combined. They can, but you write about trading zones in your book, right? About Gallisons and interdisciplinary work and all that. And to me, it's always a question of what that interdisciplinariness entails, right? And who is supposed to be interdisciplinary? The humanities scholar going into the technical domain and reading up on the entire history that might be relevant when it comes to computer science, or even more relevant, maybe statistical knowledge. And to what extent are we demanding the same sort of interdisciplinariness of say the more technical domains, right? So I tend to get this question of what is technical expertise, and sort of almost a sense that of people in more humanities-based fields and media studies almost like excusing themselves of not knowing enough or not knowing it all. And I just wonder whether that's such a productive way of going about solving these problems. Yeah.
Okay, so we are approaching the hour. I can see 5 questions. So how about we now turn to the participants' questions. I'll save my question for the end, and we'll see how we're going for time. We've got a fairly steady audience, so we'll see what they think about the questions. So we've got a few questions dropped into the chat and a few into the Q&A. So let's begin with the Q&A, and I trust both of you can see these questions up here. So let's begin with Maya's question at the top. It's a question about technical literacy and the humanities.
Yeah, if you want, I can just go. I mean, I think it would be good. It would be really great to have a bit of almost like a syllabus of like easily accessible technical texts. I mean, I think this is one of the advantages of the historical method, right? That you when you go back into kind of the history of some algorithmic technique, you find papers that are not yet so heavily mathematized. But I think we're really like lacking a bit more of a vulgarizing literature that is not there are books, of course, like this, Domingo's master algorithm, right? But it's also a very congratulatory type of history. So I'd be really interested in thinking about, like a syllabus of interesting texts. And I think somebody actually pasted something in the chat by Michael Buckland, right? Who's a historian of information science, who actually I think did some of those kind of texts. Yeah.
Would you say, just really quickly, because part of what we've been discussing is this distinction that Taina just elaborated on, and the kind of the pressures that people who are not engineers or developers, software makers broadly conceived, the pressure of schooling up, reading, learning things. One of the things that I think is quite remarkable in the way that you draw on Simondon is you're trying to kind of move beyond, you know, I don't want to say it's a two cultures into a third culture, but there's something that resembles that, that we see acts of technical creation as having like, let's say, characteristics that may not necessarily be alien or foreign to people who work within the humanities or the social sciences, that we kind of think differently, and that the idea of a technique can help in, you know, in its conception, bridging some of those boundaries, not least because the history that you draw upon is kind of steeped in documents, you know, which are very familiar to you know, to people who work with documents.
Yeah.
Shall we take the next question by Elizabeth? These algorithmic families, this was from early on in the discussion, are they well known within computer science, or do they remain to be classified? So I think it was a reference that you made early on. Yeah, do you recall that?
No, absolutely. I mean, there is quite a lot of classification work going on in computer science. I mean, there's Donald Knuth's the art of programming, right? That does a lot of that work. I mean, me myself, I'm sometimes breaking through those conventions. And I'm still really afraid that some information scientists are going to scold me, right? But yeah, I mean, there is quite a bit of work in there, but it's also then not necessarily at the level of granularity that's ideal for humanities scholars. So I could, you know, imagine something, yeah, that has a little bit, again, a bit less detail, is maybe more generalizing. So I think there's still quite a bit of space to come in from the outside and talk about these kind of families, or yeah.
Okay, should we keep going? And of course, Taina, if you want to add anything, just jump right in. But otherwise, we'll keep going through, and we'll see how we go. So the next question was from Jesse. I wonder, how can analyzing the individuation process through socio-historical lineages tell us more about what technological systems do at the time they do it, particularly with regards to some sub-schemata, e.g. deep learning models, only manifesting a posteriori?
Yeah, I mean, if I understand that question correctly, I think first of all it gives you some kind of you know, almost like technical vocabulary. I think there is a really pedagogical component to the historical method, right? If you look at the you know, a contemporary computer science paper, this is like extremely hard to read, right? This is the level of detail is really extremely can be really overwhelming, and so I think it's really kind of a way in, right? And in many ways, I think that is, of course, a bit of a problem, right? That the algorithmic technique then doesn't determine the work that is done in the here and now, but I think it gives you a level of literacy that then facilitates the analysis of what's happening in the here and now.
Okay, question from Alex. Can you both reflect on what the algorithmic rise you explore in your work means for the perceived objectivity on computers and computing, in what Daniel Rosenberg identifies as data before the fact tendencies? Also, does it link to metrics quantification in visual public life?
Yeah, that one's a bit more difficult.
Yeah.
Oh, Taina, please go ahead.
Yeah.
Good timing.
I'm just thinking that yes, it does absolutely reflect sort of the idea of computers and computing being objective, especially if you look at the ways in which something like the algorithm as sort of a signifier or a thing that is just thrown around in empirical domains is used and thought about, right? As something, again, in the context of journalism, that's invoked as something that can that has its own logic, and sort of that might be used as a way to sort of withdraw from notions of subjectivity, or which of course then is a bit ironic then in the field of journalism that so heavily draws upon ideas of editorial responsibility, but there are certainly ways that the idea of something being more objective, which is then objective in terms of reflective of people's wishes. So that's how it's then characterized. So the objectiveness is something that is heavily related to the rise of personalization. So not somebody else deciding what you're supposed to see, but something objectively reflecting your own interests. And I think there's a lot of interesting discussions to be had about that sort of notion, and who it's catering, and how we might intervene in those spaces where those sort of claims are made about algorithmic workings.
Yeah, maybe if I can just add like one aspect to that, like real quickly. I mean, I have real difficulty discussing, you know, this question of the objectivity of algorithm. I think I really don't know what that word objectivity means. But the way I think my book maybe discusses kind of that shift is that the argument that I make is that, well, you know, the algorithmic techniques for information ordering are moving from universalist perspectives to, you know, perspectivist perspectives, where suddenly the question isn't so much is it objective or not, because you're pursuing an interested goal, right? You're trying to make a distinction that is, you know, profitable for your goal of governance, for your goal of money making, and so forth. And I think in that space that Alain Desrosières called accounting realism, the question of truth is simply not the it's not the critique. And I think we have the kind of critiques that we bring to algorithms are very much these kind of truth critiques still, and I think those are not the most efficacious techniques.
I have to say, I absolutely love that part of the book where you're talking about accounting realism. It really resonated with my own research into decision making for the dashboard book that I continue to try to finish. But I think it really hits the mark. That question of truth and truth value is something that becomes really kind of secondary, or kind of, let's say, really not the question. We have one more in the Q&A from Uri. This is a question about really expertise. And the question is, do you see any advantages to not having intimate, in detail, practitioner point of view technical knowledge of technology when doing social science, humanities research? And I guess in some ways, this is a question that kind of resonates with the methods that you take up deliberately, Taina, in If Then, where I guess not having, but really trying to mobilize a kind of a naivety, and then to try to make that productive through kind of inventive modes of experimentation or inquisition. Yeah, so does somebody want to answer that question?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
I guess yeah, just to follow up on what you were saying, Nate. I think that it's important that just because you don't have or you don't identify as having a certain body of knowledge, that does not mean that you should, not, or that should not keep you from pursuing an interested stance towards certain phenomena and certain objects. So I think that as kind of a grounding way of thinking about it, I just think that that if you're interested in something called algorithms or software or the influence of data on society, then there are ways of being interested in those sorts of things without having something called technical knowledge. But I also think that being interested in cultivating that vocabulary that Bernhard also talks about in his book is certainly a good way to go. Is something that might make the space of imagination broader. So I think it's really important to be curious on all levels, right? And I think there is a certain tendency to oversimplify and just move on, or just throw out concepts too lightly without either historicizing or thinking about what those mean in technical terms. But I just think that there are many ways of doing that, as long as you you don't do things lightly. So that's sort of my way of thinking about it.
Okay, so I'm conscious that we are slightly over time already. So let's look towards rounding things up. I can see that there are some questions in the chat, but I don't think we have time to get through all of those. Apologies to Notch in particular, who is my immediate line manager. So no diss intended, but we can talk about this in detail afterwards. Bernhard, I wanted to flag a line of inquiry that we didn't follow, but to me, I remain deeply intrigued by, which is the discussion of information retrieval in relation to a kind of Foucauldian project of the episteme. I think the way that you, I don't want to say flirt, but that you entertain this notion in different times throughout the book, I think is really productive, and I think it's something that really makes the book and all of the work that kind of goes into it also aim to make contributions on a level that I think is rarely attempted in works of software studies, for sure. And I think it's really something that I encourage others to kind of ponder about, as I have. But the question that I wanted to pose for the two of you is really one about the contemporary, more public-facing discussion. And so, of course, the current discussion, in part, as I opened with today, has often focused on either questions of opacity, and I'm thinking, in particular, the notion of the black box that we've seen taken up in many different contexts. And it's something, of course, that Taina, you've addressed explicitly in your Neither Black Nor Boxed writings. And Bernhard, you also take up in different ways in the current book. So this topic, and then the other topic that you see regularly is bias, right? That the algorithm is biased, or that it contains bias, or the training set is biased, the inputs, all the outputs are biased. This kind of really strong framing of the work that algorithms do as bias. And for those of you who are in the last presentation, saw Louisa Moore's book, she does a good job of kind of beginning to unpack that. But my question to the two of you is, both of you have challenged this notion of opacity through the methodological notions of technography and mechanology. So the technography, the approach that Taina takes up in her book, is really based on these kind of experimentations from the user end to kind of learn about, let's say, the operations of the algorithm, and the mechanological approach that Bernhard takes is historical in its method. And although you go to great lengths to talk about how this doesn't mean you can know what PageRank is doing at any given moment, because of course the combinational potential of different techniques and small things like weighting different parameters and so on can have massively different outcomes. But nevertheless, it's a mode of knowing that is productive. So my question, by way of kind of a long-winded background, is how do the ways of knowing enabled by these two approaches, by technography and mechanology, how do they enable us to move beyond conceiving algorithms as mere containers for bias that need to be identified and then neutralized or removed? I hear time and time again in my interdisciplinary scenarios, people talking about removing the bias or neutralizing or minimizing. How do the two approaches that you have fostered in your research help us to redirect or alter or move beyond or flatly just deny that question, that line of inquiry?
Should I go? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a really big question, right? Because these topics in particular, right, opacity and bias are, or sometimes transparency and bias are really kind of the centers of what people are discussing now in certain circles, and I would fully agree that those are really important questions, particularly when it comes to certain sectors, just such as criminal justice or access to credit. I think where also the technologies are more contained, and we can have some idea of what what transparency could mean, right? And maybe we have also some working definition of what bias, and particularly what unacceptable bias would be. But then there are, of course, like many systems where algorithms do all kinds of things that aren't very well qualified through the term bias, right? I sometimes like the term, for example, character, right? The epistemological character of a particular knowledge production process, and I do think that for this you need a more open language, right? You need a more speculative way of thinking, what's happening here. And in particular, I think when you start also moving into a political economy direction, which I think is really where at least I want to develop my work toward, where suddenly you're no longer in like fixing liberalism mode, right? But wondering about like larger shifts of power. And I do think that to come really to your question, that mechanology, I think, gives you like the way that Simondon has developed it. I think it gives you an understanding or a way of dealing with technology that allows to see kind of these larger working principles in relation to other working principles, right? And I think particularly it connects well, although Simondon would probably have had none of that, right, to a political economy, because I think it allows you like a different, like a much deeper view of what technological processes are capable of, right? So I think it's a much less immediate form of critique, in the sense that it's maybe not something where you would that you would apply, you know, to a particular tool, to fix its consequences. But I think it allows to connect functioning to these broader concerns that are maybe also a bit more in the longue durée.
I can see, therefore, why you so favorably cite the kind of historical work on accounting and double entry that is dear also to my research. But I think that it's helpful to hear that connection. Taina?
Yeah, so I think a lot of, I mean, for me, what it comes down to with discussions around bias and discrimination is perhaps less about locating where it happens or to what extent, you know, because I think they're, you know, of course they're biased. Like, you know, if we think about having a point of view or working in specific ways, right? Having legacies coming from different places, just like Bernhard writes or documents so well in his book, right? That I think this also connects to what you were saying, Bernhard, about like why this talk about objectivity. So to a certain extent, the talk about bias connects to discussions of objectivity. But I think at the end of the day, it's about the worry of what those things that we have such a difficulty in locating or knowing does in the real world, right? So no matter what we call them, something is happening as a result of certain systems being applied in those domains, which is also why I liked Louisa Moore's cloud ethics so much, because it's really about thinking how those systems, rather than an algorithm, does something to the domains in which they're applied as a solution, right? So how our understandings of bias or justice, which is something that you also briefly touch upon in the concluding chapter of your book, Bernhard, right? How are those terms changing? How is our understanding of what those are supposed to be changing or evolving as we're using those systems as, you know, forms of knowing those terms? And I think that's sort of the real issue here, right? Whether those are evolving in a way that we're comfortable with or not, and not so much about, you know, they're locating them in some technical finesse or something like that. So, and to me, I'm also interested in where that expectation or understanding of those systems come from to begin with. What does this idea or notion that they're biased or discriminatory do to you know, the solutions that are proposed, and whether those maybe sometimes come in the way of sort of our possibilities for imagination, to go back again to Bernhard's book, right? So are they maybe doing sort of a form of harm, although they're you know, they mean, these discussions mean well, but you know, how can we think about it in different terms if we open up imagination more widely, as to kind of reiterating and insisting on those ways of framing the issue? I think that's sort of where I'm coming at this problem, what interests me in this space.
Excellent. I think yeah, the idea of bias as a kind of strategy that opens up a channel of response, but also carries with it its own baggages and traditions. Perhaps not a technique, but certainly something that has its own kind of set of historical coordinates. I bet in your work on journalism, it also has kind of new different resonances and connotations as well with the history of journalistic bias in particular. Okay, so we have arrived at the end of our session. I just wanted to thank you two very much, Taina and Bernhard, for joining me today in the middle of this persisting global event that is unending and seemingly getting worse here in the UK by the day. So thanks for agreeing to do yet another video conference. Thanks to everybody who showed up. I can see we've still got quite a few people listening and watching in. So thanks a lot, and stay tuned. We have another event next month where we will be talking about COVID-19 apps. So stay tuned, and thank you.